underutilized. Is that it's really, really hard for humans to live at the polar regions and work. It's even harder in space. So the advancement of technology plays a role here because, well, if we humans can pursue our purposes in the polar regions or in space, using our proxies, our robots, our AI, well, that's going to enable purposes to be met and conflicts to ensue that were never possible with inferior technology. If we have war in space, will it inevitably be a robot war? So the key question, we already have attempts like the Antarctic Treaty and treaties between nation states over the Arctic for resolving conflicts in the polar regions of Earth. Should the rules be the same for resolving those conflicts and conflicts in the frontier region of space? We do have an outer space treaty. The exploration and use of outer space is supposed to be for the benefit of all mankind, free for exploration and use by all states, not subject to any national sovereignty claim, no weapons of mass destruction, exclusively used for peaceful purposes, the moon and celestial bodies. Notice that doesn't say empty space. Astronauts are the envoys of mankind, to whom I guess we got to wait to see if we meet aliens. States shall be responsible for the national space activities carried out, either by their governmental or non-governmental entities. The states should be liable for damage caused by their space activities and should avoid harmful contamination of space. Now, careful reading of this says war is not absolutely ruled out, however, as a way of resolving conflicts in space. You can't use weapons of mass destruction, it says. But war is not explicitly forbidden. And in particular, then, a real issue in space conflict is what is called dual use issues. And that is when you take a civilian technology that can also have a military application. So for example, space mining, right? Now, Leonard Kahn gave a great talk this morning about just war theory. And so I'm going to very briefly talk about that, and in particular, just the aspect called the revisionist versus classic just war theory. In classic just war theory, jus in bello, how you conduct yourself in war, the rules of actually fighting the war, are simply a separate independent issue from the justice of the war itself. It doesn't matter if you're a Nazi soldier or an American soldier in World War II, you fight under the same rules, and it's independent of whether your side is the just one in fighting the war. Revisionist just war theory simply denies this independence thesis. It says, no, in some sense, the rules for how you get to fight the war depend to some degree on the justice of your side winning. If you believe this, so that the two have some kind of dependence on each other, what matters? Is it the type of conflict? Do we have different rules for fighting wars between symmetric and asymmetric wars, civil wars, ethnic wars? Does it matter the type of combatants? Non-state actors? Could businesses fight wars, say in space? Could we have SpaceX and Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic arming their rockets? Does it matter who's doing the fighting? Should the rules be the same for robots? Robots directly controlled by humans, or robots that are acting autonomously, so-called laws, lethal autonomous weapon systems? And this gets us to dual use. I hope Jen's here because ever since 2 years ago, I first gave a talk on space weapons. And so I introduced rods from God. And so now I feel like every time I share the stage with Jen, I have to talk about this. So a rod from God, as you can see, is not a bomb because it doesn't have any explosives. Instead, it just uses kinetic energy. It's revolving around the Earth, 36,000 feet per second, roughly 17,000 miles an hour. And that's a hell of a lot of kinetic energy if you just drop it to Earth and it hits something. And well, even without an explosive, the kinetic energy gets translated into something equivalent to a small nuke. No radiation, of course. So speaking of dual use, I have a space mining operation and I've dragged an asteroid to near Earth orbit to mine it for valuable minerals. And somebody wants to take out their enemy. I could fashion a rod from God and drop it on their head. Just from the dross, the detritus from the mining operations. So location. Is war in space going to be ethically bound by the same rules and reasoning as in normal terrestrial war? Or for that matter, war in the Arctic or the Antarctic? And should our advanced weapon systems have the same rules? Because I'm here to tell you, Space Command says no. The US military says for now, laws, completely autonomous lethal weapons systems. They say they are not going to use them in terrestrial warfare, but they say they have to use them in space warfare. Human commanders will be out of the loop, as Lieutenant General Thompson said, because by the time we know our satellite's fighting another satellite, the war will already be over, the battle. I'm not going to spend much time on these scenarios. Feel free to ask about them in the questions, just because, again, I want to make sure we have time for questions. So we can imagine, as I indicated, Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, Blue Origin, using one of their space tourism cargo shipments, right, to ferry troops for ultra quick strike. SEAL Team 6 could get from here to Afghanistan in, well, about 60 minutes if they just rode a rocket ship. Space mining. I already mentioned someone could pay for a rod from God as part of a space mining operation. What about anti-satellite operations and attacks from private contractors? Or what about colonization attempts in conflict, right? If Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos both want to colonize the moon or Mars, and their colonization attempts come into conflict, what are going to be the rules, right? Are we going to allow lethal autonomous weapon systems or predictive policing using AI to predict when the crimes will happen? Should the rules be different in space than they are on Earth? Well, to think about this and a whole lot more, I am a co-founder of a new group called Project Lodestar. And here's our kind of mission statement. As we reach outward, the entirety of humanity needs to be engaged in preparing for the future issues we will encounter. And we need to include underrepresented marginal communities, indigenous peoples, ethnic groups from non-current spacefaring nations, in identifying and engaging with the issues, including the development of guidelines for responsible space exploration and development. We want the global community to participate. Okay. So if you're interested in our little endeavor, feel free to contact me. We'll be looking for advisory council members in the coming year. Hopefully we'll be coming out both with advocacy missions and with probably research mission statements, all that kind of jazz. We're just getting started. So I know I covered a heck of a lot, but hey, that's why we have Q&A. So, all right, Emma, over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Keith. That was fascinating. Yes, thank you. People can go ahead and throw their hands up or toss questions in the chat if they don't want to read them out, and I can do that. Either option is excellent.
However we want to do things, folks. Do we have a question yet? Not sure if I see any in the chat.
I think.
Okay, all right.
I don't know who beat who here.
Okay,
but.
yeah, so I can't see everyone, but okay. Zachary, I see you have a question, so I'm gonna unmute yourself and ask.
Okay, great. So I arrived just a moment late, so you may have already explained this, but for my own sake, I have to ask. One of the topics that you brought up along the way was this question, should it be different in space? And I guess I want to split that into two different questions. Question one, does it have to be different in space because of practical constraints? Is there a pragmatic reason why we are going to do things different? And then what should we say about that? And another one, should it be different ethically or morally? And that one, at least on the ground, I don't see why we should think that, like, for example, the rules of war, whatever those might amount to, if there's such a thing as a just war, why I guess I'm not seeing the motivation for why that would be different. There might be different like practical things, but for example, if it's a bad thing to torture humans to get information or something here on Earth, I think it doesn't matter if you do it in space or anywhere else. It's just a bad thing to do for standard ethical reasons. And so I wonder, like, are there cases where you're seeing that actually coming apart in the moral dimension? And if so, why? Or are you mainly focused on pragmatic, we have to do things differently, so that's going to change some of these dynamics?
So if you believe in certain actions that are mala and say just evil in themselves, presumably that wouldn't matter. But on the other hand, we have the ought implies can principle in ethics. And so as what we can do changes, what the ethics of whether or not we should may well change. Because our ethical choices are always a function of what's possible, right? It doesn't make any sense to say we should demand unaided humans perform all operations in space and don't allow any robots to do anything in principle, because in practice, what that would mean is there's no activity in space. At this point, technologically, we don't have a choice, right? So what does that mean for conflict? Well, at the very least, to address the first part of your question, practically speaking, of course, things are going to be different. The rules have to be different in space because, well, there are things we can't do there that we can do here and vice versa. Frankly, it's a lot easier to resolve conflicts by force if you're weightless in some ways, right? Or if you don't have to worry about gravity and so forth and so on. Different conditions, different possibilities. Now, what does that mean in terms of the rules? And do we have to completely rewrite international humanitarian law for space? Well, that's what I and my group are trying to figure out. So it's a really good question. All right, Ashley, you had a question. So if you want to unmute yourself.
Awesome, yeah. Thanks, Keith. So I think you just used an example of maybe it was like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk kind of coming into some sort of conflict over something on the moon, which sort of reminded me of something.
Hopefully hypothetical, but I'm not really sure.
Right, yeah. So that just sort of got me thinking that I was kind of conceptually unclear actually on how to understand what would constitute war in space as opposed to, you know, something else like, you know, just some sort of criminal violent conduct, right? That's not going to, you know, sort of fit this sort of definition of how we see it here, sort of, you know, terrestrially or whatever. And so so maybe you covered this at the beginning, and I apologize, I also was late. So I was just hoping you could help me understand how you're answering that question and, you know, how I should be sort of thinking about that.
It's a terrific question. And it's part of what we're trying to figure out too, the so-called red line issue. And so in just war theory, we talk about jus ad vim, right? The use of force short of war. And there's tremendous controversy over that. So like, for example, does launching 6 missiles at a terrorist in Syria count as an act of war, or is that just some act short of war, right? Is launching a drone strike at a member of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, does that mean we're at war with Pakistan? Well, the US sure thinks not, right? And so forth and so on. So, of course, all these issues are going to continue. That's part of why I prefer the term forcible coercion, right? But that's not going to cut it when we actually move to policy. For ethics, I think it may help us, right? When is it permissible to use forcible coercion? When is it not, right? But unless we rewrite international humanitarian law, the category war is a really important one. And we're going to have to try to answer that question. And is the answer going to be different in space? Probably. Again, partly for the reasons I just talked about. Okay, Gail, I think you had a question.
Yes, so you started out talking about how, you know, a lot of the frozen areas in the north are going to be changing. People are going to want to come to Russia and to Canada.
Mhm.
Well, I did just read a very long New York Times article, I think in the past week or so, all about this. And it suggested that even though it's true that the Russians have been talking about this for decades, how they're going to profit from climate change, it didn't say the Canadians have been talking about it, but it said clearly the Russians have been talking about it for decades. The same article also said it's really short-sighted for the Russians to think they're going to come out ahead and that climate change is going to be their cash cow, because such dramatic climate change, if we don't stop it, is going to undermine what might look in the short term like benefits. I mean, it's true that suddenly they'll be able to plant wheat where they can't, and this will start, and it's already starting, a migration from China up to Russia, because so far the Russians don't want to go east, but the Chinese want to go north. And so definitely there would be huge change and short-term boosts to productivity, but that overall, to say that you're just going to let the temperature go scorching because you think it's going to help your farming won't take into account, you know, storms and other disasters, let alone what you're talking about, permafrost, melting things. And so, I mean, there may be a mad scramble, but what about the wisdom of telling people, don't fall for the short-term mad scramble? You think you're going to come out ahead, but the only way to come out ahead is if we join together to try to stop this climate change. I mean, what about that kind of argument?
That's part of why I helped found this Project Lodestar, Gail, because I mean, unfortunately though, lots and lots of people are going to pursue short-term gains that come at the cost of the global commons and the global good. And so that's why I think we have to prepare for the reality that conflict's going to happen. If only talking to people and reasoning with them worked, we'd all be a lot more important than we are, I'm afraid. And on that note, maybe I better let Jen ask her question, especially because she might just not even want to ask a question. She might just want to start her talk.
No, I have a question.
Oh,
I
okay.
always have questions. Also,
That's
I'm so
one
glad
thing
you
I like
talked.
about you.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad you talked about rods from God. It's like my favorite thing, in a really horrific, terrifying way. Yeah, like it's great.
That's what I specialize in.
Yeah, it's perfect. But I am interested, right, in thinking about, and I think this is exactly what your talk is about, right? Because it seems like one of the underlying worries is that, like, one of the ways we got international humanitarian law, right, is sort of the outcome of the so-called great game, right? So you've got all the great powers kind of duking it out, right? And eventually folks are like, well, that's not going to fly. And so we get international humanitarian law. I'm a little bit worried that I'm a lot worried that the scenario you're setting up for us is where we're just going to have a repetition of the great game in space. And that, given your answer to Gail about, sadly, people just aren't amenable to philosophers' arguments, is that like we're going to have another great game in space in order to get the kind of restrictions that we need, right, in order to sort of stop some of these horrific effects. Would that be a correct way to understand what you're saying?
I hope
I
not.
suppose.
And again, that's part of why I formed Project Lodestar, to try to stop this. I mean, the way I look at most of my research is it's an attempt to avoid the first generation problem. The way humans typically deal with things is some first generation has to suffer from a new technology and its effects, even die from it, before then we start regulating it, before then we agree on sensible policies. And I'm hoping to exercise some foresight, right? And say, let's think about the likely problems, the likely conflicts beforehand, come to agreement with the stakeholders beforehand, right? Before the mass deployment of this new technology. And that's what I'm hoping for. I would, in these conversations, I hope help, right? I would be lying if I said I was entirely optimistic, right? But hopefully we can make at least a dent, right, in the people who actually make the policies in their thinking. At least that's what I hope for. And on that note, I'm guessing we're out of time, although I'll defer to our chair here to determine.
About 3 more minutes if you want to use them up.
Okay.
Otherwise.
Right. Yeah. Jen, you want to ask a follow-up?
Can I ask another question? Is that okay, folks?
Fine with me.
Cool. So I was going to ask about dual use technology, because I know we've talked about this a little bit before, but I actually think one of the interesting things about dual use technology is it just might make it the case that all warfare fails the discrimination criteria. I mean, could that be a way of use, right? I'm sort of thinking like in your vein, like let's use some old school stuff to do some new school stuff.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if there's a straightforward argument there, right? Where most space technology is dual use. So any attacks would be indiscriminate. So like, nope.
Right.
Is that possible?
Yeah, I actually have argued in the past in a paper I published, wow, like 8 years ago now. I'm getting old. For a kind of possible reductio ad absurdum here, I said maybe we should allow lethal autonomous weapon systems as long as they can satisfy an increasingly severe principle of discrimination or distinction, so that they get better and better than human at distinguishing a legitimate target from civilian non-legitimate target. Until finally, maybe we could pass a rule saying the only legitimate target is another robot. And then effectively, we've got rid of war as killing humans. So, if something along those same lines could happen in space, if technological developments could go hand in hand with advances in our moral reasoning and our policy decisions, hey, what do you know? Right now, we have these special kind of GPS guided missiles, right? That are a hell of a lot more accurate than the bombs we dropped in World War II. Let's make that a requirement, right? To continue cutting down on collateral damage. Hey, what do you know in space, right? We can put in sensors and AI algorithms to determine when this space mining operation is going to be used for an illicit purpose. Let's demand that kind of technology be part of any legal mining operation. Right. So I'm hopeful, again, that with foresight, we might be able to hit that kind of solution. We'll see. Was there another question or?
There's one comment from Gail in the chat.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Paula, were you going to speak?
I was going to just ask a quick question about your project Lodestar.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you looking for input, and what do you intend to do with, the policies and so forth that you are developing?
All that is to be determined, Paula. So that's a great question. because we literally just got the website up last week. So you are literally the first conference, the first public announcement of its existence. So what we have decided is that we're going to have an advisory council. We're going to try to reach out to people from every nation all around the world, all groups, and try to start a conversation on these issues. And so again, if any of you folks, especially senior folks, are interested in being part of our advisory council, let me know, and we'll take you into consideration. I have, I'm a fan of the Concerned Philosophers for Peace, but I can't speak for my 5 other co-founders of this particular group. So I think Paula Smithko would be a great addition, but I don't know if I can speak for everyone else. So any other questions? I think maybe we should turn it over to Jen.
Yes, I think with that, it's time to turn it over to Jen. And I'm sorry, I was supposed to have pulled up what your topic was about. So just a second here, so I can properly introduce you. Jen will be speaking on refugees and the environment and is from University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. The floor is yours.
Cool, thank you so much. I too think Paula Smithko would be an amazing person to have on Project Lodestar. If I can just second that, that sounds great. Oh no. So thank you so much, Emma. And I'm not talking about anything so nearly as cool as space war and space peace. But I am talking about also sort of environmental justice. And the focus of my talk today, as Emma said, is refugees and the environment. So as some of you might know, I work on just war theory, and in particular, I work a lot on refugees and the so-called refugee crisis. And so for this paper, I'm attempting to expand that discussion to think more about the environmental aspects of the refugee crisis, because my concern is that that is something that very commonly gets overlooked in these moral, political, and legal discussions that we're currently having around the refugee crisis. So I'll sort of talk through that, and then we'll go from there. So just to get you started, it's important to recognize that in the world today, there are anywhere from 68 million to over 72 million refugees and refugee-like persons. I give you those numbers, and there's a discrepancy of about 4 million there because of counting issues. So one of the things that is at issue is the definition of refugee. So in the sort of seminal international treaties, laws, protocols, a refugee is somebody who's fled their state of origin because of fears of persecution on the basis of their social identity. However, in sort of de facto international humanitarian sort of discussions, refugees are also those persons who have fled because of the threat of military conflict, right? But it's important to recognize that persons who fled because of the threat of military conflict actually aren't covered by standard legal definitions of refugees. So when I talk about refugees, I'm thinking about refugees and so-called refugee-like persons, which are persons that haven't been given the formal designation of refugee, but I count them morally as refugees, because I think anybody who has fled either because of fear of persecution or because of fear of military conflict counts, so to speak. So I just like to start out with that so that you know what group that I'm talking about. When we think about the refugee crisis, we tend to think about 3 different sort of events. They're not really events, but they're 3 different aspects. So we tend to think about refugee flight, okay, which is when refugees and refugee-like persons flee from their country or state of origin, or the place that they're currently living. We tend to think about refugee encampment, which is because many refugees currently live in camps, which are entirely extra legal, by the way, right? There's no provision in international humanitarian law for the existence of refugee camps. They are a stopgap solution that has sadly become rather permanent. There are many third-generation refugees still living in camps. The average stay in a refugee camp is 18 years. And so refugee camps are meant to be temporary, right? Encampment is meant to be temporary before resettlement occurs. And sadly, they are permanent. They are often permanent. The third sort of arena of refugee concern is refugee resettlement. Okay, so states and other polities do have obligations under international humanitarian law to resettle refugees, either in so-called safe states or back in their state of origin when that becomes possible. Okay, so what I'm going to argue is that in each of these arenas of concern, there are issues of environmental justice that aren't being appropriately considered. Okay, so that's kind of the plan. Okay, and so what I basically want to do is complicate our existing political discussions around refugees by just sort of highlighting these environmental aspects. Okay, that's sort of that's the formal thesis. If you are looking for a formal thesis, that's what I'm doing. So first, consider refugee flight. Okay, so this is when folks flee, right? Either because of persecution or because of the fear of military conflict. In order to flee, refugees must travel either on known pathways, right, or break new trail over land and water. Okay, both options represent significant danger, and a number of theorists have talked about this. In particular, Botany Baron and Serena Parekh talk a lot about the dangers of fleeing. What I want to point out is that refugee flight has significant environmental impact as well. If refugees use the so-called usual routes to flee, not only do they alter the route's environmental features via their continuous use, right? But refugee presence along these routes also invites state and other political groups to sort of, at best, monitor those routes, and at worst, block or destroy them to prevent flight. Certainly, perhaps one of the most famous examples of this, at least in the Western Hemisphere, is the construction of the US southern border fence, right? So think about that case, but also think about the construction of border fences in general, right? This border fence, we can talk all day about the moral and political implications, but another thing that we can also talk about is the environmental impacts. So a number of environmental groups, both on the Mexican side of the border and the US side of the border, have fought against the construction of the southern US border fence on the grounds that it blocks migration routes, it destroys habitats, right? It indelibly alters ecosystems. And so there are real environmental impacts here, right, that are occurring because of the ways in which refugees must go overland to flee, right? So when they use the usual routes, okay? So just to give you a couple of other examples, right? Desertification in portions of Africa has also been linked to the movement of large groups of refugees. Although it's worth pointing out that in Africa, we're seeing an interesting phenomenon where a number of refugees who are living in camps throughout the southern portion of Africa are working on the Great Green Wall project, which is an attempt to stop the desertification on the southern edge of the Sahara and reclaim the land for farming purposes. So there you have erosion, but also reclamation of land. But in both cases, the environment is being altered, right? Sort of by the presence of large numbers of refugees. I gave you two sort of land examples, right? But it's also important to remember that many refugees flee over water, right? So think here about the construction of the floating blockades in the Mediterranean, especially off the coast of Turkey and off the coast of Greece. These floating blockades impact aquatic migration as well as marine ecosystems. We've also seen large amounts of both coastal and coral erosion because of refugees utilizing known departure and landing sites when traveling across water. And so all of this is about refugee flight over the usual routes, so to speak. And sort of the final point about refugee flight, and this is a rather horrific point, but it has been raised by some folks working in environmental studies, which is that often when large numbers of refugees are fleeing, often several refugees will die during flight, and their bodies are often left both on land routes and in water. And the presence of large numbers of human bodies can, as we know, carry disease and make certain portions of land and water unusable, both for other humans and for other animals. That's a horrific point, but I think it's important to look at sort of square in the face. So now think not only about refugee flight along the so-called usual routes, right? But think about also when refugees break new trails, right? This also has a serious environmental impact, right? And importantly, it also has a political valence, right? So the creation of new pathways between territories opens up a series of political opportunities and dangers, right? So when refugees break new trails, right, there's both the threat of border shift, which sort of established polities are likely to see that as a threat. But there's also the opportunity for border shift, right? So what we might call more up and coming polities might see that as an opportunity, right? They might say members of our state are moving along into this territory. We're just gonna take that territory, right? And so you have border shift issues, whether that's a feature or a bug, right? It's nonetheless of serious environmental import. In addition, right, when refugees break new trail, you have sort of all of the usual problems when new routes are established, right? Such as the presence of piracy, the presence the lawlessness, right? Where there's nobody monitoring those new trails, right? So if you're a refugee, this lack of monitoring could be a good thing, or it could be a bad thing, right? So on the one hand, if the new route is not yet monitored, then you have more freedom to flee, right? But on the other hand, if the route is not yet monitored because it's new, you are in greater danger, right? Because you don't have sort of the presence of political units that could, in theory, help you in some way, right? But regardless, what happens, right, is that with refugee flight, you get monitoring of safe passages, you get sometimes blocking of safe passages, and sometimes you get the destruction of safe passages, right? So one thing that we have seen from states recently is that when refugees attempt to open up new routes, states will destroy those routes, right? They will sort of blow up pathways between mountains, right? They will attempt to make certain passages no longer passages, right? And so again, this indelibly alters the landscape, right? It alters ecosystems. It just has a huge environmental impact that is just not paid attention to, okay? And what's interesting here, right, is that these environmental impacts further complicate the political situation in lots of different ways, right? Sort of as I started to mention. So that's refugee flight, okay? So now going to the second arena, think about refugee encampment, okay? So as I mentioned sort of at the beginning of the talk, refugee camps are often ad hoc, right? They're extra legal, and as a result, they are often ad hoc. This is not always true, but it is often true. Refugee camps often pop up around the borders of political conflicts that either have been hot for a while or are going hot or have just gone hot, right? And they also often pop up around the edges of so-called safe states, right, where refugees are fleeing to. So you get a lot of refugee camps on sort of Greek border islands, sort of on the Turkish border, right? This is where you tend to see refugee camps, on the Bangladeshi border, for instance, as well, right? But what happens is, because these refugee camps are placed often on borderlands and are often placed ad hoc, what happens is that they're usually placed on land that is either already degraded from previous overuse, or that is like otherwise undesirable or unstable or unusable. Okay, and so what happens is you get refugee encampment, but because of the location of the camps, that location itself increases the already precarious nature of life as a refugee, right? So as I mentioned, refugees already are subject to a series of vulnerabilities on the basis of their status, right? And now with their encampment, they are often living in spaces that are not conducive to life for humans, right? Like, that's why the land is available, okay? And so the very environment in which they are warehoused, that's Serena Perrick's word, I'm borrowing that from her, is not, like, the very environment where they're placed is not amenable to their survival and human flourishing, right? So a recent example of this is the mudslides that ravaged the refugee camps in Bangladesh, that were housing many of the Rohingya that fled Myanmar, sort of during the UN hasn't declared it a genocide, but I'm very tempted to declare it a genocide. Sort of during the attacks on the Rohingya living in Myanmar, they fled to Bangladesh. Bangladesh encamped many of the Rohingya in an area that was known to be prone to mudslides, right? If the land got too much pressure. Well, turns out putting about 1 million Rohingya on the land produced too much pressure, and there were a series of devastating mudslides, right? So the Rohingya's presence in the camps on the Bangladeshi border precipitated the mudslides. And the mudslides were an environmental disaster, right? And so what happened to the Rohingya? They were subject to an environmental disaster, right? Where sort of any sort of stable life they had managed to create in the camps was wiped out, right, by the mudslides. And so now they're subject to an environmental disaster on top of the political disaster that they're already living through, right, being subject to an attempted genocide and ethnic cleansing. Okay, and so when we think about refugee encampment, we need to think not only about the fact that it's extra legal, but also that it puts people in a situation of environmental vulnerability. So that's thinking about encampment. I'm going to move on to refugee resettlement, just in the interest of time. We can talk more about encampment if you want. But so moving on to refugee resettlement, right? That's the third arena. Recall that resettlement usually involves placing refugees into new states, right? Some state or polity that is not their state of origin, okay? Sometimes resettlement can involve placing refugees back into their state of origin if the persecution or military conflict is no longer there, but much more common for refugees to be resettled to so-called safe states, okay? But as many theorists have argued, right, these recipient states must ensure that refugees have both political rights and some modicum of social acceptance, right? Because both are needed to have a chance at a flourishing life, right? So there's been a lot of moral and political discussion about what recipient states owe to refugees. And arguably it's both political and social obligations, so that refugees have a chance to escape the persecution that they've suffered, right? But in addition, I want to point out a fact that I think is so straightforward that, like, sometimes people miss it, right? Which is that refugees need space. Like, they need physical space. They need land on which to live, and they need the physical resources to form communities that are sustainable and have a chance at flourishing, right? And so it just turns out to be true that some potential recipient states have the requisite land and other environmental resources that are available to create a flourishing human community, but other states do not, right? The famous example of this is Lebanon currently, right, which has taken in a large number of refugees, right? But Lebanon is a very small country, and one of the problems that Lebanon is having is they just don't have physical space, right? They're really struggling to actually grow enough food to feed everybody who is currently living in Lebanon, right? And that is an environmental problem, right? Just it's about what the land is able to support and what the land is not able to support, right? And so I think one of the things we need to look at is that it's part and parcel of states' political obligations to refugees, like part and parcel of their political obligations to refugees are their environmental obligations to refugees. Okay, so when we talk about what states owe to refugees, we have to remember that they not only owe them sort of political rights and sort of social rights, they also owe them environmental rights as well. Now, of course, this isn't a unique concern, right? It's true that all people need space, but it is salient to an important question that is being wrestled with currently by a number of states, and it's sort of shot through contemporary international humanitarian law, which is the question of which states have what obligations to refugees, right? So if we accept the ought implies can principle that was invoked by Keith earlier, right? One of the things we have to look at when we're thinking about what states have obligations to how many refugees, right, is like, how many refugees can states physically support, right, given the environmental resources that states have, because not all states have the same environmental resources, right? That just turns out to be a fact of our world that we need to grapple with when we're thinking about states' obligations to refugees. And I think it's often sort of left by the wayside, right? And so ultimately, right, when we're thinking through how to solve, right, or ameliorate the refugee crisis, we have to pay attention to how refugees interact with the land. So I think if we fail to take account of these environmental complexities, we fail to see the full dimensions of the problem. And ultimately, if we fail to completely understand the problem, right, we're going to struggle to actually do what we ought to do in response to refugees. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we have time for some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. That's fascinating. So again, as with last time, we can go ahead and, oh, there we go. Go ahead, Keith.
All right.
I always have questions for Jen too.
Yay. Ask away.
So, terrific set of issues. It seems like a solution to all of these problems would be for the UN to negotiate with an existing nation state a kind of guaranteed refugee resettlement area, right? Whether or not that was then their long-term destination. Presumably with a fairly wealthy one with enough empty land. So I immediately thought of Australia's Northern Territory, except I'm sure the folks down in Oz might not be as fond of this idea as you and I. And that gets us to the political problem. And as you mentioned, dot implies can. So while we can come up with solutions, are they going to be politically feasible? I mean, what do you think?
I mean, I would like them to be. Yeah, I mean, so I think the question of political feasibility is really important, right? So in Alex Bellamy's new book about the refugee crisis, right, he starts from the premise that global North states are just not going to let in sufficient numbers of refugees to make any difference. And so we need to start looking at how to persuade global South states to sort of solve the refugee crisis. I don't want to do that because that feels like giving up the principle in toto. And so I think we need to think hard about political strategies, right? But notice that when we already jump to the question of refugee resettlement, right, we could go still further back, right, and say, well, why don't we just make it so there are no wars, right? Let's restructure the political setup of every state so there's no more persecution, right? I think we can always push it back. But I do think one of the things to say is to say to states that have space, right? Like, look, you have space. Like, that's not a political answer. But I think maybe it's the start, right? It's to start these conversations, right? And say, like, there are two senses in which it's unfair to Lebanon, right? So A, Lebanon does not bear the entire burden, right, of helping refugees. But it's unfair in this further sense, right? In the sense that Lebanon is really small. Meanwhile, the US has Montana. Like, I don't know if anybody's driven through Montana lately. There's a lot of states, like, right? I mean, the US uses, like, I mean, there's so much empty space. Now, I don't know a lot about land, but basically I'm just kind of raising these issues. I unfortunately don't have solutions. Sorry, that was a roundabout way of saying, yeah, I agree and I don't know. I don't know how to fix it. Make me queen. I will fix it. That's the solution. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Nobody has questions. Everybody's just convinced. That's what it is. Zach, go for it.
I mean, well, first, thank you. That was a great talk, but also I'm pretty much convinced. But I guess I have some questions about certain details, in particular in that exchange you just had with Keith. One of the things you said was, well, okay, if we step far enough back, we can just erase war and persecution, and we fix the problem. I guess I'd want to say, no, there's another step back from there, right? I mean, I know we're not classifying them this way, but here's another like pseudo refugee. A really horrible natural disaster occurs and an entire area is rendered uninhabitable or very difficult to survive in or something, and people have to. Seems perfectly possible to me, in which case you're going to have migration. In fact, this happens all the time, not necessarily on gigantic scales as large as whole countries and persecution and war, but it does happen. So in those cases, I kind of wonder if you need to just, and not like you in particular, but like you in the general, all of us sense, need to like take on board this broader definition of refugee and think that that's just as important in all these cases. We need to cover all cases of this forced migration and include those. And I was more wondering, do you think there's a reason we shouldn't do that? Like, will that create some kind of complication that is a hindrance to the refugees properly termed now versus helping people who are displaced for other reasons? So it's sort of a more speculative question into what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think that's certainly a way to go, right? So that would be more along the lines of an open borders argument, right? Of saying like, look, we should treat all folks who want to migrate equally, right? Regardless of whether what they have suffered is sort of the fault of natural disasters, right? What other humans have done to them, right? I suppose is a way of saying that. So I'm coming out of the just war tradition, I will say, which works with the idea that we can make a distinction, right? And the distinction is just what I described, right? That there's a difference between people who have suffered at the hands of other humans, right? Versus folks who have suffered, but nobody has done that harm to them, right? So to speak, right? So folks who suffer from a natural disaster have been harmed. I think that's true, but they haven't been harmed by other humans, right? Now, of course, the complicating exception to this is folks who've been harmed by natural disasters that are the result of climate change, which we know is human caused, right? So like, yes, I saw that question coming. Right, because and that's what the big fight is now, right, about climate change refugees, right, is how to make sense of climate change refugees. Ought we understand them as refugees, where the harm they suffer is the result of human action, right? In which case, certain international humanitarian laws kick in, right? Or ought we understand them as sort of like the victims of any other natural disaster, where in the general international norm is something like it's supererogatory to help, but you don't have a strict obligation, right? Now, we do have collective duties of easy rescue, right? So like there is somewhat of an international norm around the idea that like if folks suffer a natural disaster and you can help them easily, you should. But one of the problems is that the refugee crisis is of such a scale, right, that the duty of rescue is no longer easy, if that makes sense. And so I am trying to hold on to that distinction, which sort of puts me in the realm of I'm trying to think about folks who suffered as there is like at the hands of other humans, as opposed to all migrants in general, because I do think that distinction is worth holding on to. But I'm appreciative you could go the open borders route if you wanted.
Yeah, if I could just throw a quick follow-up in here. I think that really helps clarify what's going on and what's at work. And I guess one last clarification I want is, with that distinction in mind, your justification, as I understood it there, was, look, international law or humanitarian law is a certain way, so we need to react to that. And I guess I want to know also from you in principle, are you thinking of that as an important distinction to hold, even if you were queen of the world and could rewrite international humanitarian law? Would you still hold that distinction, or would you drop it at that point once we are just totally talking an ideal theory and we're, off in our magical fantasy land of joy and peace?
I love magical fantasy land. I still would want to hold on to that distinction. And the reason is actually for what Leonard just put in the chat, right? Because I do think there is a distinction between being harmed and being wronged that's important here. And in other work, I've argued that refugees, as I understand them, have been wronged. So there's a strain in just war theory that wants to understand refugees as collateral damage, in which case they've been harmed but not wronged. I argue against that claim. I think refugees have been wronged. So I think we have duties of justice to them, right? Which is why this international obligation kicks in. I'm happy it's in international law, but I think it's important even if it weren't legally binding, right? I think it's politically binding. So
thank you. That helps a lot. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah. Kate, you want to jump in?
Yeah, great. This is kind of a totally different part of the argument I was going to ask about, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about environmental rights and how strict you understand that in terms of the requirements we have, especially if we're trying to think about like non-ideal solutions. So let's say I take in a bunch of refugees and I give them some land, and it's like pretty crowded land and it's kind of a desert and it's not great for growing stuff. But I say to you, look, this is still much better than them being crowded in camps for 18 years. And this is still much better than them traveling around perpetually for 18 years, creating way more environmental destruction. Do you want to tend towards like, well, it's something, so that's good? Or are you thinking of rights as like, I have a strict obligation that I have not met, so we can't really count that as a success or as progress? Does that make sense? I'm wondering how strictly you want to think about that.
Yeah, no, that's a really helpful question. Thank you. I think I would, this is going to be so unsatisfying to everybody. I want to split the difference. I want to say, like, I know. But
no, it's like a trick question. It's fine. It's hard to say, like, do you really mean it? But like, how do we, I guess, how can we tell if we're making progress, right? If this is the ideal, we know where we are now, what would count as significant moves in the right direction for you, I guess?
Yeah. So I think significant moves in the right direction for me would be to really make resettlement programs much more robust, so that we stop having these extra legal encampments on really awful land that is in many cases like not really livable, right? And so the land is only made livable by the massive importation of food and water and medicine for folks. Right? I mean, that's how these camps survive, right? They're mostly like just through the massive transportations of goods to them, which we know is not sustainable over time, right? So I think if we could create a more robust resettlement program, right? And then start to have these conversations. I sort of think exactly what you said, right? I want to hold the ideal, right? I want to say like, look, refugees need a minimal chance for a flourishing life. What does that include? It's going to include political rights. It's going to include social rights of certain kinds. And I want to say it's going to include environmental rights, right? You have the right to space on which to live and the material resources that you need to live. And I think once we set up a robust understanding of that, then we can understand diachronic progress towards that, right? While sort of being sympathetic, like to states that say like, look, I'm trying, but I don't have all the resources. And we can say, yes, we appreciate you trying, and here are some other things we can do. That's not very specific, but it's what I've sort of got right now.
That's helpful. Thank you. And thanks for the talk.
Yeah, thank you. Emma, how are we doing? Are we at time?
Our time is technically over, but I think we have a few minutes maybe.
Well, I know Ashley had a question, and then after that, I had to close down and get ready for the next.
Okay. All right, Ashley, you want to jump in? Also, hi.
Hey, hi, Jen. Yeah, thanks. I guess this is, not so much a question as maybe just a comment thinking about, I know you said, you're not necessarily thinking of, solutions or whatnot, but it sort of struck me that, if we sort of might consider this type of, these sort of patterns of refugee resettlement and flight and all of that as a sort of, expected consequence of warfare, right? So thinking sort of, from the ad bellum perspective about, the expected environmental damages in the sort of way that Leonard was talking about earlier might be kind of an interesting way to go to think about, how that might play in.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And in sort of other work, I've argued that the knowledge, right, that refugees will be one of the results of war gives us reason to think that the justification for jus ad bellum is even higher than we thought it was, right? So it might not cancel out war altogether as a possibility. As folks at CPP know, I'm not a pacifist, despite all y'all's many great attempts over the years. I'm getting closer and closer though, maybe. But I do think that's right. I think that's exactly the way to look at it, right? Because we know that this is what wars do, right? Wars create refugees. Maybe the new exception being wars in space. I'm not sure. I don't know if there are going to be refugees in space. That's a question for Keith. But we know that wars right now certainly do this, right? And so no refugees in space. Okay. And
not
so
for long.
Yeah, fair, right? Fair. And so I think this, I think there's two ways you could look at it, right? So either the expected creation of refugees, right, or folks who take on the status of refugee, either makes the jus ad bellum justification question even higher, right, because it shifts the proportionality burden, or you could also put it into jus post bellum, right, and say that this is going to change the obligations of states at the end of wars as well, right, and they're going to have to make provision for helping all the folks that they have wronged in the process of committing the war. And I think you could go either way. I tend to go with the jus ad bellum, but you can also go jus post bellum here. I hope that answered your question.
All right, I'm going to need to